Live from Arlington, Virginia, this is Transport Topics Newsmakers, the digital interview series that gives you access to candid conversations between industry experts and a veteran reporter. Sponsored by DDC FPO Solutions. Here's your host, Dan Ronan.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers from Transport Topics. Our guest is someone who is well known within the trucking industry when it comes especially to economic matters, and we welcome back for a return engagement Bob Costello. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Economist at the American Trucking Associations here in Washington, D.C. Before we begin our conversation with Bob Costello, I want to tell you that DDC FPO Solutions is our sponsor for this edition of Newsmakers. Let's watch this commercial, and we'll be right back with Bob Costello on the other side.
According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 531,200 new IT jobs will need to be filled in the next 10 years due to advances in cloud computing, big data, and information security. Of course, not everyone in the supply chain invests in innovation at the same level. That's why it's crucial to take responsibility for the success of your own technology. From customer visibility to route and asset optimization, data transmission and security, driver mobility, business intelligence, and more. The transportation sector's need for IT talent is overwhelming. Unfortunately, so is the cost. The average annual salary for U.S. IT professionals is $113,639, over 23% more than the rest of the world. DDC FPO, best known for its premium freight billing services, is now offering IT outsourcing to provide you with the right talent at the right price. We'll partner with you to identify the best skill set among DDC's strategic operating locations so you can hit both your development milestones and your financial targets. The future of logistics and transportation lies in technology and innovation. Don't let a lack of resources hold you back. DDC's reliable, scalable, and cost-effective IT solutions arm you with the premium programming talent you need to achieve your goals. To learn how our IT outsourcing services can support your success, contact DDC today.
First, a little bit about our guest, Bob Costello. He has been with ATA now for 23 years. He's the Federation's chief economist, and he is responsible for all of ATA's collection, analysis, and dissemination of trucking economic information. This includes several monthly trucking economic indicator reports, motor carrier financial and operating data, and the annual freight forecast, driver wage studies, weekly diesel fuel price reports and economic reports, as well as the yearly trucking almanac. He also does economic analysis for proposed regulations and legislation that impacts the trucking industry. Bob has a master's degree in economics from the University of Northern Iowa. Bob, welcome back to Transport Topics and Newsmakers. We appreciate you taking time to join us.
My pleasure, Dan. I always enjoy doing this with you.
Bob, we are about a year in terms of the length of the pandemic. It has really been impacting us now for about 10 and a half, almost 11 months. Where are we at in terms of the overall U.S. economy?
Yeah, it's been a struggle, hasn't it? It's interesting times for people like me that do economic forecasting. I mean, when you go to graduate school for this stuff, they don't teach you about pandemics and what you have to that we would have thought we'd come into something like this. The economy is doing better, and no doubt about it. It doesn't mean everybody's doing better. I actually think, we had some stimulus late last year. It's pretty likely we're going to get some form of stimulus. We don't know exactly how big the package is. The president proposed $1.9 trillion. Is it closer to $1 trillion? Is it somewhere in between there? I don't know, but all of that will help. And so as an economy overall, we're doing better. We're starting to grow. We had really strong growth in the third quarter. The fourth quarter will probably be around 3% growth, which is still better than historical averages. Maybe a little bit lower than 3% here in the first quarter, maybe 2.5%. But then I think things can pick up a little bit as more of the stimulus hits the economy. So overall, not every sector is doing well, but overall, we're not in too bad a shape. Of course, there's some red flags out there we can probably discuss later, but not bad shape right now.
Trucking seems to be doing pretty well in most sectors. I mean, if you're running refrigerated, if you're running flatbed, and you're taking items for home construction, whether it's lumber or HVAC equipment or You're taking furniture for new homes, additions and room construction and the like. Boy, you seem to be pretty busy.
Yeah, there are definitely parts of our industry that are not only busy, I mean, they're going full out, right? E-commerce is just crazy right now, and that certainly was late last year with all the holiday sales. But you mentioned some other ones. Temperature-controlled freight, especially around for grocery stores, that's very strong. And even flatbed freight around, especially, Dan, around single-family home construction as well as remodeling. But even within those groups, dry van, temperature-controlled, flatbed, you do see pockets of weakness. And it just depends because this economy is not all growing at the same pace. So primarily we're doing pretty well. But if you're a fleet listening to me right now, you may say, well, scratching your head going, my freight's not that great. Believe me, not everybody's is. There's parts of even flatbed that are struggling. Tank truck around energy consumption, that hasn't been that great. So overall, like the economy overall, not too bad. And in fact, there's pockets of real strength out there. Likewise, though, there are pockets of weakness, just like with the broader economy.
Bob, early on when we were talking about this, and you and I have had dozens of conversations over the last several months, we talked about what type of a recovery it's going to be. There was some concern of a double-dip recession. That seems to be out of the way. But now there's talk that it may be what's called a K recession, where folks on the upper end who can work from home, they're seeing their incomes and everything rise. But folks who are in maybe the lower to middle tier of the economy aren't doing so well. Where would you put the recovery?
Yeah, you nailed it. It really is a K-shaped recovery, and it's because, as I said earlier, there are parts of the economy and there are parts of trucking that are doing very well. But there are parts of our economy that are not doing so well. Some of the easy ones to pick out have to do with those industries, those businesses where we like to gather in larger groups, right? That travel, restaurants, experiences, whether that's going to, and you and I both love baseball and we love sports generally, right? Going to baseball games, and going to concerts and so forth. If you're in that, the movies, if you're in that business, if you're in that line of work, boy, it is tough, right? It is, and that's the part of the K that is downward sloping. But if you're, and we sort of mentioned it earlier, if you're around e-commerce, if you're in single-family housing starts, that is also very strong. Another one that hasn't been as strong, maybe not as bad as some of these services that require, us going places in person, is factory output. It is improving, but in 2020, we saw factory output fall 6.5%. So there again, there's another part of trucking that if you're really in servicing the factory sector, it might have been tough. Now there are even pockets of strength there, right? Autos wasn't too bad. Let me give you some other numbers though, Dan, around this, in this K-shape and the upward sloping and why we're doing well. If I look at retail sales, retail sales overall in 2017 were up 3.5%. In 2018, up 3.3%. In 2019, not quite as good, but up 1.8%. Overall in 2020, retail sales, excluding e-commerce sales, I should say, all of those were excluding e-commerce. Retail sales, excluding e-commerce in 2020, down 2.7%. But e-commerce sales, just e-commerce sales, up over 20%. And those were doing well before. They were up 12.5, 10 to, let's call it 13% range over the last 3 years, up over 20% last year. And even by December, excluding e-commerce, total sales were up year over year, 0.5% is all, whereas e-commerce sales were up almost 20%. So you can see very starkly different. If we look at grocery stores versus restaurants, I mean, restaurant sales by the end of, and of course they fell off a cliff last spring and came back, but even by the end of last year in 2020, we were still at levels back in early 2015. And whereas grocery stores, after surging early in the spring, were down, but if you exclude that surge, at the end of last year, we were at all-time highs. So it really, this pandemic has got us buying different, things, right? We're buying more goods versus services. As we sit at home, we're doing more e-commerce shopping than going to stores. We're not traveling. We're buying more goods. We're not going to movies. We're buying more goods. So that's where the K-shape comes in, right? There are parts of the economy that are doing well. And those people, like you said earlier, it's a good point. A lot of us are the luxury of being able to work from home, but not everybody has that luxury. And not everybody, if people aren't going to businesses, a lot of those people have been laid off. And so it really is, it's the have and the have-nots, if you will. If you happen to be in the haves, things are not bad right now. But if you're in that have-not group because you work at a business that has had to shut down or temporarily close, it is very tough. And that's why I think it was important to extend those unemployment benefits for everybody. That will get money. They're going to pay their rent. They're going to go buy groceries. That will all ultimately help us as an industry, and why we needed to support those people going forward. And again, I think there's more of that coming through another stimulus. We just don't know how large that will be.
You know, in a recent conversation, Bob, you said that the U.S. economy has the potential later in the year to grow at 4%, maybe even a little more, which is a pretty remarkable number. But the key to all of this is, again, the COVID-19 situation, this horrible virus that we're dealing with. What's your thoughts on the rollout of the vaccine and why this is going to be such an important seminal moment in terms of getting the economy back on its feet?
Yeah, so you bring up two good points, Dan, and that is what will help us get to better growth rates. And right now, my baseline forecast, just so the viewers know, is about 2.5% growth here in the first quarter of this year, then accelerating to 3.5% by the second quarter, and then averaging about between 4 and 4.5%, maybe even higher than that in the second half of next year. Why? Two main reasons. One is we're going to get a shot in the arm, literally, from the vaccines, right? And that is, as more of us get vaccinated, we can go back to life as normal, and that will help. More on that in a second. The other shot in the arm, if you will, is going to be from more stimulus. And that will absolutely help get the economy on a more solid foundation. And, look at, when we went into this spiral in the spring, it wasn't because the economy had something fundamentally wrong with it. And in fact, going back prior to the pandemic, and you remember this, Dan, I was talking about how the economy and trucking were going to start to accelerate some. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the pandemic happened. So based on those two shot in the arms, one being fiscal stimulus, the other one literally being the vaccines, I do think we can get to a good place by the second half of this year. Now, if we're not wearing our masks, if the vaccine isn't as effective, I'm not saying any of that will happen. You have to watch out for those things. As an industry, we've got to pay close attention. Let's fingers crossed that does not happen. But I think we can get to a point in the second half of the year where it is strong. Are there risks? Yes, there are absolutely risks. But things do look brighter. One other thing on this, Dan, though, I think as an industry, what we have to come to terms with is at least parts of it. So remember, in this K-shaped recovery, trucking is also K-shaped. There are parts of our industry that are doing very well. There are other parts that are struggling. As with the vaccine is being effective and more of us get it and we're getting herd immunity, and we go back to, and boy, I hope this happens, we can go back to baseball games, see the Nats, and do those sorts of things. We will start spending more money on services, and the growth in buying of goods is going to slow down. So if you're generally in retail right now and you're like, I am just going gangbusters because people are buying goods, I do think as we go and progress through this, you have to realize that that part of the economy could slow, not necessarily fall off a cliff. I'm not saying that, but the rate of growth is going to slow. But there are going to be other parts of the economy that start to accelerate. We won't have a 6.5% contraction in 2021 in the output of manufactured goods, right? That'll improve. And so there are parts, even in flatbed freight, there's parts of flatbed freight that have been very good, but we could see improvements in others and so forth. So there'll be a balance that comes back to a more normal sort of situation. Remember, all of this buying of goods has been good for the industry and those parts of it, but that's not sustainable in the long run. I do think that e-commerce has gained some market share that it's going to keep, but I just want people to realize that if you're in the bad part, as this vaccine comes around and we start to see better economic growth numbers in terms of GDP, you can start to see better times. Likewise, if you've been killing it because of all this sales of goods, just understand people are going to start spending more money on services again, and that will likely slow your growth rate.
That's an interesting point you make, Bob, because I was reading a story the other day, and I love history, and this looked at the time period in the United States about 100 years ago when we came out of the pandemic at the end of World War I. And what happened in the 1920s, we had the Roaring '20s. We had movie theaters, we had Babe Ruth, we had baseball, we had all of those things for a period of 8 or 9 years until the Great Depression, where the economy really took off. Do you think that there's the possibility that we could be in a period of sustained growth and have a nice long stretch here where things, if politically things remain stable, we do pretty well?
It's so interesting. My sixth grade daughter is just learning exactly about that right now in history class. I do. I think that there are a lot of good, again, the fundamentals of our economy were solid. And, I'm sure there's there might be a couple bubbles here and there, nothing dramatic, nothing to worry about. We're getting some stimulus. And likewise, even if inflation picks up a little bit, I think that's not a bad thing. And I don't expect inflation to get out of control. I think you have a Fed that is very accommodative. And in fact, I saw that Chairman Powell actually just sort of scolded the rest of the FOMC group that helps determine interest rates, saying, stop talking about normalizing interest rates, right? Because that's probably not going to be here for a long time. And so I do think we have a solid footing. I think the biggest challenge for our economy going forward is something that we are very familiar with in the trucking industry, and that is having enough available quality labor. I always say this, we're eventually going to go back to our long-run growth potential. No doubt about it. It probably won't be this year, but it's coming at some point, and that's closer to 2% GDP growth, not 3% plus that I'm expecting this year. And the reason for that is we simply don't have enough people to sustain those higher GDP numbers. So we could do. We could start having more kids, right? Although that takes time. Or we could look at immigration. And I know immigration is going to be one of those policy issues that comes up certainly early in this administration. But just for folks to understand, that is a way to get your economy to grow faster. So eventually we will go back to these more normal growth rates, but I just don't think it'll be this year. I think there's a lot of both fiscal and monetary accommodation, and that's going to help us through the remainder of this year.
Since you're an economist and not a politician, I'll still ask the question, though, Bob, are you optimistic that the politicians will get this right? We have a new administration in Washington in the person of Joseph Biden as president. We have a new transportation secretary, designate Pete Buttigieg there in that position as well. New commerce secretary, a whole new team that's come in, new Congress, Democrats narrowly control the House and Senate. Are you optimistic that we can start to see some movement on some of these big ticket items that are not necessarily political questions, but are political and economic questions?
I certainly hope so, Dan. The last thing I'm going to do is forecast politics, right? And so we'll have to wait and see. I'm hopeful that we're at a place where we can start to compromise and get things done, because it's just too important. You brought it up, infrastructure. We have been talking about this for years. And as an economist, I will tell you that's some of the best government spending. It's got ripple effects for years to come when you improve roads, when you expand our capacity. And maybe with this administration, we're going to start to see some investments in some newer technologies, maybe not brand new, but certainly things around environment and so forth. And, that can actually it's certainly not all bad. It's good for the environment, but it can also have ripple effects throughout the economy in a positive way. And so I certainly hope so, Dan, because the stakes are quite high.
When it comes to infrastructure spending, yes, there's billions of dollars that are spent on roads for the rebar and for the asphalt and the concrete and the like, but it also does mean that you spend money for gasoline and diesel to get the product to the construction site. You spend money for the labor. You spend money for all of those things. And that there's that multiplier effect that economists like to talk about in terms of, $1 actually creates $8 or $9 in economic benefits.
Without a doubt. And that's what I'm saying. It's some of the best government spending because, and for everything you just said, but think about this. Not only that, we know in our industry spends billions of dollars a year sitting in congestion. And of course, as commuters going to work, that also happens. So if you can expand capacity in the throughput of vehicles, that also has a ripple effect throughout the economy in a very positive way. So it's not only all the things you talk about in the building, but once you've built it, it provides efficiencies for years to come.
And also reduces congestion and also causes more taxes to be put into the government coffers because businesses build closer to the new roads. They expand. They do all of those things because they want to be near to the new highway interchange because it's advantageous for their business, which means they hire 8 or 9 people to be hired to work at the oil change shop or the convenience store, or whatever that is.
Yeah, and not only that, by increasing the throughput and the speeds, we also help the environment.
Yeah, and we get a more efficient economy. I want to talk with you because you brought it up, and I know that you like to talk about this. The driver shortage. You've pointed out that we're about 65,000 drivers short right now of what we need to be at an optimal level. It's probably higher than that, though, because of the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. We've had tens of thousands of drivers disqualified because of the illegal use of substances and the like. And not many of them are applying for reinstatement. So those are people who are at least on a temporary quasi-permanent basis. They're out of the industry till they go through the steps to be reinstated.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Dan. And I think there's a bunch of things going on that have led to this situation. Back in the spring, the driver shortage probably went away for a month, maybe 2 months. And now it's back, and it might be as bad as ever. I haven't actually put pencil to paper to calculate where we stand today. I will be doing that a little bit later this year. But it stands to reason, based on numbers I'm seeing, as well as talking to fleets, it's really tough out there. And here's the thing. It's no one reason. I think it's a multitude of things. So let me go through some of them. One is, I do believe that some fleets have gone out of business. Now, maybe not as much as I was expecting. It's probably not so much COVID related because those fleets that were hurting got some government money and PPP. But before this pandemic, we were talking about liability insurance premiums going through the roof. That really hasn't changed. And so, yes, the spot market rates have gone up enough that maybe some folks could afford it a little bit more. But I bet you some fleets have gone out of business. Fleets are operating fewer trucks than they did a year ago. Late last year, a lot of, when you look at the truckload space overall, a lot of these fleets were off 3.5% in terms of the number of both company tractors and leased on independent contractors than a year earlier. It's not like they want to do that. They just cannot find enough drivers to put into seats. So even though retail sales are good, orders are good, that's for replacement activity. It is very difficult to build capacity in this environment. Another reason is the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouses you mentioned. As of January 1st, we had seen over 45,000 drivers be put in prohibited status And almost 35,000 of those 45,000 haven't even started the return to duty process. So that's, almost 35,000 drivers that are just gone that we had a year earlier. And then another big one that I don't know that everybody realizes is that the pipeline of new drivers coming into the market is less, perhaps significantly less. If you talk to fleets and truck driver training schools, we might be off, the pipeline of new drivers coming to the industry are probably down 30 to 50%. That might be as much as the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse in terms of number of drivers that are no longer in our industry. I also talk to fleets that say we've seen some drivers that have left the industry either temporarily or permanently due to the pandemic. So you start adding up all of these things, and it's a real significant amount of drivers that are no longer in the industry. And by the way, even if we all got our vaccinations tomorrow and we could go back to normal, this is a hole that is going to take a while to dig out of. You don't just add all these drivers overnight. It's going to take a while. So I think this capacity crunch is here to stay for a while, and you're not going to get out of it by adding a bunch of enough drivers overnight. And as long as the economy doesn't crater, and we don't think that's going to happen, we think the opposite. I think this is something the industry is going to struggle with for a while before we can fix it.
Right after Christmas, Bob, MasterCard and Pulse came out with a survey that showed that holiday spending in terms of e-commerce as a percentage of the economy increased in just 8 months. And this figure just astounded me. I wasn't surprised by it, but it was one of those head-slapping moments. Before the pandemic, it was about 13% of the total economy. Now it's more than 20% of the economy, and really pushing out brick and mortar. I live not far from an Amazon fulfillment center here in Maryland, and I see these Sprinter vans going up and down my state highway, which butts into my neighborhood. I see 20, 30, 40 trucks a day just going by in one when I'm at a stoplight. The increase in e-commerce has been phenomenal. But is that also, and the second part of my question, is getting some of those drivers who are driving Sprinters and driving the smaller trucks, is that a way to eventually have them graduate at some point into the industry, maybe with the larger trucks at some point? Is that an entry point for them?
Well, you bring up two good points. And one is, and we talked about it a little earlier, I mean, in 2020, you saw, and when you look at the retail sales numbers and look at what's essentially online or e-commerce sales, it was up over 20% for the year, and this was a segment that was growing, 10 to 13% a year on average. So we were up in significant, which is unbelievable growth, and we were up significantly more than that. And so you're right, we have a lot more of these drivers driving these vans and smaller equipment than our tractor trailers, and perhaps that's an opportunity to graduate some of these folks to the over-the-road environment. But there's a flip side to that, and that is, they're home every night. And one of the challenges that we have, and we all know this, is in that over-the-road market, people don't like to be on the road, even if it's for a week at a time before they get home. And so we're going to continue to struggle with that. I mean, when I tell people, and I talk to folks in the government, and I talk to other folks and talk about there's no one reason for the driver shortage, and therefore there's no one solution. But I'll tell you this much. I don't care what you're short. When you have a situation where demand outstrips supply, what happens to price? It goes up. And that is happening right now. So if you're a truck driver, your wages have been going up in a global pandemic, far exceeding that of what we're seeing for the economy overall. And that's going to continue to happen as long as we have this situation where demand is outstripping supply, and driver wages will continue to go up. If it was only, but I'll say this much, if it was only about driver wages, in a sense, this would be easy to fix, right? We just know
pay everybody more.
Yeah, right. And it's going that way. But what I'm saying is, even when you get there, because of the demands of the job, and you're on the road, and especially during this time of a pandemic, when you've got so many, people have kids at home doing virtual school and not going in person and so forth, it makes it a big challenge, and it highlights that challenge. And so this is something we're going to struggle with as an industry for the foreseeable future.
And here we also have the DMVs across the country in most of the states operating at only 45, 50% capacity. I've got a son who's high school age, and it took 6 weeks to get him an appointment online to get his learner's permit. I can imagine what the backlog is like for the men and women who have come through the driver's schools and gone through that and now trying to go do their CDL test. Now they got to wait 2, 3, 4 months to get a slot to go take their test.
Absolutely. That's a huge part of it. And thanks for bringing that up, because I failed to mention it earlier. So it's not only the throughput at the schools that is less because of social distancing requirements, but it is also then the availability to get a CLP, or you take your test for your CDL. And a lot of times, if you can't take that test right away, you forget and aren't practicing, you may not pass it. So these are all challenges, and certainly a pandemic situation that is making the driver shortage even worse.
Bob, but you sound, in conclusion, as we wrap up our conversation, you sound like you're an optimist that maybe the worst is over, that we've endured the worst that COVID can throw at us, and the economy dropping into that enormous gully in the second quarter, that maybe better times are ahead.
Generally, Dan, I am. I've already told you, I think we could, see really nice historical GDP growth rates by the second half of the year. But this is what my warning would be. And so, yes, put me in the optimist camp, but I'm also a realist. And that is, we need to be on top of the situation very closely and follow this. If for some reason these variants of the virus start to get worse and where the vaccines are not as effective, and of course, wearing our masks, and if we're not doing that enough because we think that the vaccine is just, we need to get to a point where down the road where we have enough people vaccinated, and until we get to that point, there are risks. So yes, am I an optimist? I am, but we need to stay and watch this closely, because it could turn on a dime, I'm afraid. I don't think that'll happen, but we need to watch it so that we're ready to adjust as an industry, as a business, should that happen.
Bob, I've always said, both here and on Sirius XM, that if things work out, my best hope is that sometime, maybe after the 4th of July and Labor Day, we've got enough immunity that we're able to go to a ball game, we're able to go to a concert, we're able to go out to dinner, and I'll make a deal with you. If that works, we'll find a Cubs versus Nats game in Washington. I'll buy the first hot dog.
That sounds great. My Nats are making some moves. I think they know they have a limited time to go try to get back to the World Series, so I'd be excited to see that.
Well, my Cubs, not so much. I think this is going to be a rebuilding year, but we'll go and enjoy the ball game nevertheless. Bob Costello has been joining us. In closing, we want to thank our sponsor, DDC FPO Solutions, for making this Transport Topics Newsmaker webcast available. We also want to thank our guest, Bob Costello, for being so generous with his time to answer our questions. This webcast will be available for viewing on demand. Go to ttnews.com for more information, how you can watch our interview with Bob Costello. Again, I'm Dan Ronan from Transport Topics, ttnews.com. We thank you for watching.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on future episodes, visit ttnews.com. This has been Transport Topics Newsmakers.